Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Dental Wolf. So in this series, we're talking about terminology, and in this particular video, we're going to talk about overhead, EBITDA, and take-home pay, and what all of those mean. So first off, let's talk about overhead. So for a single doc practice, overhead is basically all the expenses in the practice except for the doctor's salary. Another good way to think about it is it's the total operating expenses. So that's going to include all of your direct expenses and all of your fixed expenses, including salaries, office supplies, rent, all those kind of things. Those are all your overhead. So typically when a doctor would talk about overhead, they'd say something like, I run my practice at a 60% overhead. And what they mean by that is that their total operating expenses is 60% of their collections. So whatever they collect, 60% of that goes to pay for the practice itself. The opposite of overhead you could think of as take-home pay. So take-home is basically all the earnings after operating expenses and maybe minus taxes. So in other words, it's the doctor pay plus the owner pay. It's what the doctor deposits in their bank account, both as an owner and as a doctor. So this one can kind of be deceiving because they might say, my take-home is $300,000. Well, that's because they're paying themselves as a doctor and an owner $300,000. A typical doctor compensation is about 30% of their collections. And if you're owning a practice and you're only being paid 30% of your collections and not as an owner, you're not paying yourself enough. There's something wrong. You need to figure out how to get paid as an owner as well, because that does take extra work. And then the most important term that we're going to talk about today is EBITDA, and this is the one that we're going to dive into a little bit more. So EBITDA is kind of a confusing term, but it stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So basically, it's all of the earnings after operating expense and doctor pay. So you're going to take out doctor pay in order to calculate your EBITDA. And like I said before, this is the most important number when you're evaluating a practice. So diving down into EBITDA a little bit deeper, let's understand why EBITDA is so important. The power of EBITDA is that it allows us to compare apples to apples. It allows us to compare two practices side by side and eliminate all the noise. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at a few examples. So EBITDA is earnings before interest. So why is it important to ignore interest? Well, interest is going to be highly doctor dependent. So let me give you an example real quick. Let's say you have two doctors and they own the exact same practice. They produce the same, they have all the same procedures, their staff's equally as nice, their practice is in the exact same location, alternate universe, I don't know. Just they have the exact same situation. Except for Dr. 1, when he bought the practice, he had a bad credit score. So when the bank lent him the loan on the business, he had a high interest rate. And let's say every month he just pays the minimum amount on that loan. So over time, he's paying the maximum amount of interest. Whereas Dr. 2, on the other hand, has a great credit score and therefore started off with a relatively low interest rate. And every month he pays off a little extra of the principal. So overall, his interest expense is relatively low. These two doctors, even though they own the same practice, which you are looking to buy, they might have different expenses based on their interest rate. So you want to ignore this expense in order to be able to compare two practices side by side. And the interest expense won't mean anything to you, really, because you're going to have your own interest expense. You're going to apply for your own loan. The second part of this is taxes. And this should be obvious. Taxes is one of those noise items that you want to get rid of because not everyone's going to pay the same taxes. So let's say you have Dr. 1. He doesn't have a CPA and he doesn't take advantage of any tax breaks. He's obviously going to pay more taxes than Dr. 2, who has a great CPA and is always taking all the legal tax breaks they can get. So this is another noise item that EBITDA is going to limit. The last one is depreciation amortization. Those two terms are a little bit different, but for our purposes, let's just say they're the same. So let's say you give an example of Dr. 1, his CPA wants to depreciate everything as aggressively as possible. So he's going to have a high depreciation expense every single year. Whereas Doctor 2, their CPA decides to depreciate everything in the most tax advantageous way. So that, maybe they have a high production year, high income year, and they want to depreciate a little bit more off of things. Just understand that depreciation is not going to be the same for every single practice. It's going to be based on the strategy that they're employing. So in those three ways, EBITDA eliminates some of the noise so that you're able to compare more of the apples to apples of each practice. So the biggest takeaway of this video is that EBITDA is the money that you're making as the owner rather than the doctor, and you should be paid in both ways. And EBITDA is important because it's going to help us determine the valuation of the practice. It's going to help us understand the purchase price range that we should be looking for. And we'll talk about this more in valuations, but typically the price range should be anywhere between 2.5 to 4 times EBITDA. Anyway, I hope you guys really enjoyed that video. I hope it was informational to you. If you have any comments or things that you want to learn about, feel free to message us at dentalwolfonline@gmail.com or comment down below, and we will catch you on the flip side.